All right, we are about to start. Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome from Roberta Cesana and myself. We are very pleased to begin these 2 days, which promise to be very intense, but also rich in reflection and research. We would like, first of all, to thank you for your presence and for your contributions. I will be very brief because we have a long day ahead, so I will just limit myself to a few organizational things. The first one is about the language of the conference. As you know, this conference will be in Italian and English. Unfortunately, we cannot provide simultaneous translation, but we hope that everyone will be able to enjoy most of it, and of course we can help during the discussions with questions. We can translate. Secondly, I would like to inform you that about the recording of the sessions. So with your permission, we will make the content of the conference available beyond these 2 days. To also, in accordance with the open access policy of the Marie Curie projects. This conference is in fact part of the Marie project entitled Women Translators in Italian Publishing, which I have the privilege of carrying out in the last 2 years under the mentorship of Roberta Cesana, which I would like to thank very much. But the conference would not have been possible without the organization and support of the Department of Historical Studies and of the Centro Apice, whom I also would like to thank. So I would like to hand over to Professor Mecella and Professor Cesana, representing the Department of Historical Studies and the Centro Apice. So over to you, and thank you.
Grazie veramente a tutti, grazie in primo luogo alle organizzatrici di questo splendido convegno, grazie a voi che siete venuti appunto nonostante peraltro una giornata complicata sotto vari punti di vista. Per me è un piacere oltre che un onore portare i saluti del Dipartimento di Studi Storici nella sua interezza a nome del direttore, il professor Andrea Gamberini, perché tutto il Dipartimento è veramente fiero e orgoglioso di poter ospitare non soltanto questo evento in collaborazione con il Centro Apice, ma più in generale il progetto di Teresa Franco di cui lei stessa vi ha parlato. Un progetto prestigioso legato appunto ad una Marie Curie Fellowship che aveva tra i suoi principali obiettivi quello di riportare all'attenzione della critica figure poco note o note sotto altri aspetti, figure femminili, il loro contributo all'attività non solo di edizione e di scrittura di testi, ma anche e soprattutto l'attività di traduzione, un'attività che molto spesso per alcune di queste figure è rimasta in ombra e che invece il progetto si propone di rivalutare e di studiare. Segnatamente il progetto della dottoressa Franco interessava le figure di Maria Luisa Agosti Castellani, Adriana Motti, Natalia Ginsburg e Lalla Romano, ma vedo che il convegno di oggi interessa anche altre personalità del dibattito culturale novecentesco, quindi allarga il quadro e consente di arricchire questo panorama. Dunque l'intento, se capisco bene, era quello di valorizzare la partecipazione femminile al discorso intellettuale e culturale italiano in primis tra gli anni 30 e 80 del secolo scorso e da questo punto di vista il Dipartimento di Studi Storici è stato particolarmente felice di aver avuto questa opportunità di studio perché è nella tradizione del nostro Dipartimento un'attenzione non soltanto agli studi di genere ma in particolare anche al contributo intellettuale legato al mondo dell'editoria della componente femminile. Abbiamo un esame, un insegnamento dedicato alla storia delle donne, ma soprattutto alcune delle nostre colleghe, ricordo Ludovica Brai, che ora è a Torino, ma è stata per diversi anni una colonna portante del nostro Dipartimento, Irene Piazzoni, la stessa professoressa Cesana, hanno già nel corso degli anni portato avanti progetti importanti che si sono tradotti in pubblicazioni significative. Ne ricordo soltanto alcune: L'altra metà dell'editoria, le professioniste del libro e della letteratura nel Novecento, Le donne nell'editoria del Novecento, e ancora in corso di stampa Libri e rose, le donne nell'editoria italiana degli anni 70. Un'attenzione dunque precipua per questo campo di studi che il Dipartimento ha la fortuna di portare avanti e che speriamo possa ulteriormente svilupparsi anche in futuro. Io mi auguro che eventi come questi siano non tanto la conclusione di un percorso a livello personale, per la dottoressa Franco probabilmente sì, ma per noi insomma invece l'avvio di campi di studio che ancora meritano di essere approfonditi. Rubo soltanto un ultimo minuto ai lavori del convegno e poi mi taccio, per ricordare peraltro che questo evento è per noi particolarmente importante perché si lega all'avvio di un progetto, quello del premio di studio intitolato alla memoria di Nini Agosti Castellani, che proprio da quest'anno viene inaugurato e che noi dobbiamo alla generosità della figlia di Agosti Castellani, Paola Agosti. Premio dedicato ai giovani studiosi, alle giovani studiose, laureate o dottorandi, laureate, dottorandi e dottorande, versati nell'ambito degli studi linguistici e storico-letterari. Del premio poi vi parleranno più diffusamente i colleghi, ma quello che ci tenevo a sottolineare è innanzitutto un ringraziamento davvero vivissimo alla famiglia che ha patrocinato il premio e che ci consente insomma di promuovere il lavoro dei giovani, cosa sempre più importante e sempre più necessaria soprattutto di questi tempi. E anche qui come dire, la vicinanza del Dipartimento per una famiglia che ha nella sua storia in qualche modo un legame particolare con gli studi storici. Paola Agosti è figlia di Giorgio Agosti, importante figura del nostro panorama politico intellettuale del Novecento, magistrato, partigiano, antifascista, appartenente a quella generazione di uomini del Partito d'Azione che ha segnato un'impronta profonda nella cultura dell'Italia del Novecento. E d'altra parte Paola è sorella anche del professor Aldo Agosti, collega, professore emerito di storia contemporanea all'Università di Torino. Quindi insomma noi ci sentiamo particolarmente vicini in quanto storici a questo evento, anche forse un po' indebitamente. Capisco insomma che si tratta di qualcosa dedicato precipuamente agli studi storico-letterari, però ecco, nel nostro piccolo veramente ci sentiamo davvero parte di questa iniziativa, e quindi ancora una volta di più un ringraziamento veramente sentito. Grazie.
Grazie Laura, grazie a te. Rispondo anche a nome anche come organizzatrice. Buongiorno a tutte e a tutti. In questo caso io porto allora i saluti invece del Centro Apice, che appunto ha dato il patrocinio a questo evento. Li porto come coordinatrice scientifica del centro, in sostituzione del presidente Paolo Rusconi, che per un altro impegno istituzionale non è potuto poi essere qui presente come invece vi aspettavate da programma, e così ci siamo divisi, insomma, no? Ci siamo divisi gli oneri, ma soprattutto gli onori. L'attenzione che il Centro Apice riserva al tema della traduzione e alla specificità del contributo femminile all'interno di questo preciso ambito, tanto importante nel circuito della comunicazione letteraria e nel sistema della mediazione editoriale, è un'attenzione di lunga data e che negli anni si è concretizzata anche nell'organizzazione di diverse importanti occasioni di studio, di riflessione e di condivisione dei risultati della ricerca, come nel 2021 con il convegno La fabbrica dei classici, da cui il bel volume curato da Alessandra Preda e Nicoletta Vallorani, con un'attenzione specifica proprio al lavoro dei traduttori e delle traduttrici che della fabbrica milanese dei classici a partire dal secondo dopoguerra sono stati e sono state il vero motore. E l'anno prima, nel 2020, l'attenzione di Apice invece si era puntata proprio sul protagonismo femminile nei mestieri del libro, con il convegno L'altra metà dell'editoria, da cui era poi derivato il volume già ricordato dalla collega. E quella, tra l'altro, il convegno L'altra metà dell'editoria, era stata l'occasione in cui per la prima volta Teresa Franco ci aveva fatto conoscere appunto quella che è una delle protagoniste, come avrete capito, delle due giornate che ci attendono, Maria Luisa Agosti Castellani e appunto le sue traduzioni dall'inglese. E da ultimo voglio ricordare anche il più recente seminario di Apice, Interferenze poetiche, che l'anno scorso e l'anno passato abbiamo dedicato a Giovanna Bemporad, traduttrice, potendo contare sulla disponibilità di importantissime fonti di prima mano, quali sono l'archivio privato e la biblioteca personale di Giovanna Bemporad, entrambi depositati ormai dal 2013 al centro Apice. E dunque, se è vero, come diceva Luigi Crocetti, che libri e carte sono da porre sullo stesso piano e che ciò che dobbiamo fare è disegnare una mappa, il fondo Bemporad conservato ad Apice è stato senz'altro in grado di restituirci proprio la complessità di tutte le tessere che servivano a ricostruire il mosaico del profilo intellettuale e dell'attività culturale di Giovanna Bemporad, che si è dispiegata appunto nei campi contigui della scrittura e della traduzione, quest'ultimo un ambito di intervento al quale, come vediamo, sempre maggiore attenzione oggi viene riservata da parte dei translation studies, da qualche tempo impegnati a indagare proprio modi e forme dell'agency femminile nel contesto della mediazione culturale, nel contesto del transfer culturale. E per un centro come Apice, nato nell'ormai lontano 2002 con l'obiettivo di conservare e valorizzare fondi bibliografici e archivistici che da varie latitudini intersecano la storia del Novecento e della sua industria culturale, è stato ed è davvero importante assistere negli ultimi anni a un'inversione di tendenza come quella che stiamo vivendo rispetto all'occultamento nel quale si erano finora spesso celate figure e vicende femminili. Oggi assistiamo alla crescita della volontà da parte delle intellettuali coinvolte a vario titolo nell'industria culturale ed editoriale di concedere, di affidare, di donare con una scelta consapevole, mentre sono ancora in vita, i propri archivi a istituzioni culturali come Apice e altre istituzioni di cui sentiremo parlare in questi giorni, istituzioni che appunto sono in grado non solo di conservare queste carte ma naturalmente anche di valorizzarle. Questo è un dato che indica un'acuta consapevolezza della necessità di organizzare e indirizzare attraverso un diretto atto volontario senza deleghe la conservazione della propria memoria intellettuale e direi anche sentimentale, una memoria che risulta appunto sempre più individuata e distinta, non più frammista alla memoria familiare dei genitori, dei mariti, dei figli, dove rischiava di essere dispersa o comunque era spesso difficile da avvicinare, era spesso difficile da consultare. Ed è proprio grazie alla proliferazione della disponibilità di archivi delle donne se una ricerca come quella condotta in questi 2 anni da Teresa Franco e un convegno come questo che ne costituisce il punto culminante possono accadere, e Apice non può che plaudere a questa iniziativa alla quale appunto auguriamo tutto il successo che merita. Grazie a voi.
Bene,
Benissimo.
io vi ringrazio.
Allora noi lasciamo il tavolo
Vi
e posso
ringrazio.
ufficialmente iniziare il lavoro.
Ok, allora ho forse bisogno del cavaliere di Pascal. Allora, our first guest today is Professor Pascal Sardin. I invite her to join me at the table. We are very lucky to have her here. not only because she's a leading figure in the field of women and translation, but also because she's been very, very busy recently. And so we are grateful that you decided to make Milan the last stop of your academic mini grand tour.
Yes.
She's lectured in Rome, Florence, Ferrara.
No. Florence was visiting.
Was visiting, okay, but you've been around.
Yes, I've been around. Yeah.
So it is a great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Professor Sardin. She's Professor of English Literature and Translation Studies at the University of Bordeaux-Montaigne and co-director of Masters in Gender Studies. She's an expert of Samuel Beckett, and she has she wrote several monographs on this author. I should like to mention the one about self-translation, Samuel Beckett, Autotraducteur ou l'art de l'empêchement, published in 2002, which was a genetic study of Samuel Beckett's self-translated text. But she has also signed several collective volumes on Samuel Beckett, most recently in 2021, Translating Samuel Beckett Around the World, which explores the issue of Beckett's global reception and also how national languages had an impact on his work. She edited 2 issues of the journal Palimpseste, and I should like to mention the one about gender and translation, Traduire les genres, Femmes en Traduction, in 2009. She is also the director of an international research network focusing on women in literary and publishing archives, writing and translating in 20th and early 21st centuries. Barbara Bray, that is the object of our talk today, is just one of the invisible women whose role Pascal Sardin aims to reevaluate. She has just completed a literary biography based on her archival materials. Is the book out already?
Not yet.
Not yet. So we'll wait for to read it. Her talk today will provide methodological insights into what it means to undertake such an endeavor. Indeed, her talk is entitled On Writing a Translator's Biography, Barbara Bray Out of the Archives. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Pascal Sardin.
Okay, I'll show it only if I have time because I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay. So I. Yes, of course. Yeah, it's always like that. But I can't see the display.
No, we can't see this. No, cioè, non possiamo vedere lo schermo però.
Well, I can actually, if it's It's here again. Okay, we'll manage. Yeah. That's okay. That's okay.
Stand up. It's comfortable.
No, it's fine. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry for that.
That's okay. No worries. Okay. So I would first like to very warmly thank Teresa Franco, of course, and Roberta Cesana for organizing this wonderful event. It is a great honor and a great pleasure to be here and to be given the opportunity to present on this research that has been so dear to my heart for so many years now. It is also quite fitting that I should be presenting this reflection on the writing of a biography focused on Barbara Bray in Italy, as this is where I gave my first talk on Bray back in December 2018, invited by Chiara Elefante. This was on the occasion of the release of Donne in Traduzione, edited by Elena Di Giovanni and Serenella Zanotti. Thanks to them as well. And here we are, almost 6 years later, spent researching the career of a woman who translated into English many of Marguerite Duras's plays, as well as The Lover, her most famous novel. But a woman, as we will see in a moment, who was so much more than just a translator. Today, I would like to seize this opportunity to reflect back on what it has meant for me to write a literary biography of a woman of letters. My hope is that these reflections will highlight some theoretical and methodological questions that surface when we as researchers try to make female creators come out of the shadows, as this conference proposes to do. Admittedly, some of the questions I asked myself along the years are apparently at least simple ones, among which, what is a literary biography in the first place? How does one write it? Where and when does one stop? Where and when does one stop, sorry. Other questions are more profound and existential in nature. How do we remember literary women? What's in a life? How does one distinguish the private from the public? Other questions are of an ethical nature and have to do with scientific engagement. What should I put in? And much more importantly, what should I leave out? Do I have a duty to report on everything? How do I deal with contradictory accounts? But also, what do I do with gaps in the chronology of Bray's life? Finally, the tenuous guiding thread of this talk will have to do with scientific positioning. Positing a feminist stance raises many questions. For instance, does it suffice to say that a research is a feminist one for it to be so? It also leads to questions pertaining to what that positioning implies, and what dilemmas the researcher is sometimes faced with regarding the uncovered findings. But before delving into these questions, I would like to quote from a Netflix series, from the second episode of the Netflix adaptation of One Day, the successful 2009 novel by British writer David Nichols. The romantic comedy tells the story of Emma, a young writer. It starts in the 1980s. In the extract, Emma, who graduated from Edinburgh University with a double first in English and history, she's very bright, has spent the past year touring with a left-wing co-op theater troupe. She's having a conversation with Gary, her boyfriend, who's a playwright and a theater director, who has founded the company. And Gary is asking her to keep on writing for the company. I just think we could make a good team. He's speaking here. Sartre and Beauvoir, Plath and Hughes, Beckett and Barbara Bray. So she says, but who's Barbara Bray? Beckett's girlfriend. I've never heard of her. Actually, well, she was a minor figure in her lifetime, and he chuckles. So at this point, you can see Emma with a very unhappy grin on her face after this last line is uttered. This suggests her dismay at being likened with an invisible one in a literary coupling to use Stone and Thompson's phrase, that obscures the achievements of the lesser known of the two partners, often the woman. As suggested in this dialogue, Barbara Bray's name is essentially associated with the name of Samuel Beckett, with whom she had a romantic and intellectual relationship that lasted over 30 years. As a matter of fact, the sheer importance of her contribution to the world of ideas was revealed to many, including myself, by the publication of the third volume of Beckett's correspondence in 2014. In the London Evening Standard, journalist David Sexton wrote on this occasion, "What makes this volume of Beckett's letters so compelling is a personal story, its revelation of his relationship with Barbara Bray. She becomes his chief correspondent. Out of the 700-odd letters that Beckett wrote Bray and that are kept at Trinity College Dublin, some 180 were published in the last two volumes of the series, making Bray Beckett's most visible epistolary recipient of the 1950s onward. But ironically enough, and even though during these 3 decades, Bray was a crucial part in his creative process, she was also one of his most obscure collaborators and is never credited in his printed work, contrary to his other co-translators. Ironically enough, in the documentary film titled Rue Samuel Beckett, Barbara Bray, 2015, in which Bray actually physically appears and is heard, she declares that she didn't want to be an invisible woman. But the fact remains that despite being an outstanding woman of letters, radio producer and editor in the 1950s, writer and journalist in the 1960s, screenwriter in the 1970s, theater director in the 1990s, and translator during all this time, Bray's achievements are still relatively unrecognized. So the whole point of my project has been to write about Bray, not about Beckett, to write a narrative in which, for once, Beckett is the minor figure and Bray the major one. So Bray is mentioned in passing in several biographies of Samuel Beckett, Harold Pinter, Marguerite Duras, and her name comes up in a few memoirs and autobiographies by or about Locy. This is a biography of Calder, Barney Rossett, Naima Talla. There are also several oral and written interviews of her as well, unsurprisingly mainly focused on Beckett, and more recently still a growing body of articles and academic papers. Furthermore, Barbara Bray's name has begun to enter popular culture, as we just saw. She is also a major character in the recent biopic on Samuel Beckett, directed by James Marsh, which represented her under the traits of actress Maxine Peake. The film is titled Dance First. So you can see the triangle here. I'll come back to this later on. In 1978, but on the other hand, you will not be surprised, to learn that there are numerous biographies or biographical accounts of Samuel Beckett, 3 biographies, and several memoirs, and numerous books. Probably the first problem I faced when starting off working on this book is that there aren't many examples, at least that I know of, out there of literary biographies of 20th century female of a 20th century female translator / radio producer / critic / scriptwriter / theater director. Researching the book, I did, though, read a few autobiographies and memoirs by women in search of first-hand material on Bray. So you have here Patricia Lozy's memoir, Billy Whitelaw's autobiography. Whitelaw was a favorite actress of Beckett. And some biographies like that of Margaret Ramsay, a famous British play agent. But as you can see, more men than women in the lot. That I should myself have been oblivious of Bray when I was researching Beckett's bilingual and self-translative process in the 1990s for my doctoral thesis is also understandable in a way. When I studied English literature in France, the field was still much influenced and informed by structuralism. Following the formalist and immanentist point of view, following this formalist point of view on literature, students were told that biographical approaches to literature were out of fashion, and consequently were advised to mostly disregard the biography of the author. So the archival turn, the empirical turn, or the historicist turn in Beckett's studies had yet to come, even though it started in the 1990s with genetic criticism. And I myself, of course, still had to read Sherry Simons and Simons and Louise von Flutow's monographs on gender and translation, which both point to the urgency of highlighting those careers of women translators who have contributed to the intellectual transfer of ideas. Another major difficulty is that Barbara Bray was not just a translator, as evidenced in this letter she wrote to Harold Pinter in 1974. Dear Harold, many thanks for the play. It's terrific. The contrast between what it suggests and the means it uses to suggest it is hair-raising. I can't wait to see it on the stage, to find out if I've imagined it right and to be exposed to your full effect. Just reading it was a new experience. No doubt you sent a copy to Sam. He's away for a couple of weeks, but I've told him it's probably awaiting him and he'll be licking his chops. I'm currently in the process of moving into a new, more modern studio in the same building as before, but I'm streamlining the process as much as possible. From October 1st, the phone number will be blah, blah, blah. I couldn't get in touch while I was over a week or so back because when I'd finished my commitments with Galileo, my father's health took a turn for the worse and I had to hasten down to Bath. I'm afraid it's only a matter of time there. I had to return to Paris for the move and other business. But in any case, I have to be in London for a few weeks from the middle of October, and I do hope we'll meet and talk then. I'm doing a few broadcasts for Critics Forum, among other things. I finished and handed in India Song. Should be interested to have your reaction to the English. The girls are very well. Julia is with me for a few days to help with the move as she whizzes back to Oxford from Lebanon. Kikina was to have been in China by now, but it was canceled. She plans to visit Dominica and so on. I hope all your family are well. Thank you again for the play, and congratulations. I look forward with the greatest pleasure to talking to you about it, if you will. Love, Barbara. Now, this letter, written in a beautifully regular cursive script, an example of which you have here in a postcard to James Knowlson, is kept in the Harold Pinter collection of the British Library. It lies amongst many, many other letters and manuscripts, documenting the playwright's career as well as those of his correspondents. This letter is evidence that Barbara Bray was both a close friend and a collaborator of some of the most prominent writers and film directors of the 20th century. Pinter himself, of course, but also French writer Marguerite Duras, whose play India Song she had just finished putting into English, obviously, following a commission by Peter Hall, the newly appointed director of the National Theatre, American director Joseph Losey, whose film Galileo, an adaptation of Bertolt Brecht's 1943 play she had just worked on, and Irish Nobel Prize winner Samuel Beckett, referred to here simply as Sam. The letter further refers to her work with BBC radio program Critics Forum, a weekly discussion on cinema, theatre, books, broadcasting, and the visual arts. It thus provides evidence that Bray was a versatile woman of letters and intellectual. She was not only a translator of French plays and a screenwriter, she was also a literary critic. This, for me, meant crossing the fields of translation studies and literary studies with that of radio studies and cinema studies, with which I was hardly familiar, and dealing with cultural, political, and historical matters that rarely come into account or into play in literary studies, as I was used to doing as translation studies scholar. As French sociologist Bernard Lahire has shown, agents in the literary field are often active in other occupations. They occupy various positions across linguistic, national, and field-specific boundaries. Following an article by Irène Meilatz titled "The Multiple Lives of Translators," I believe Bray had multiple, though closely interconnected lives. I will let you read it because I don't have it on my paper.
Oh.
Okay. Yeah.
You want to read it looking at the...
No, it's okay.
It's
Yeah, it's fine. Just you get the idea. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. The difficulty lay in fact that if previous research had been done in media studies about women's public voice and on the representation of women in the media industries in the past 2 decades, so these are a few examples of this research, I did not find anything about translators working in the media industries and crossing field-specific boundaries. Maybe because this constant intersection of fields, one of the main problems I faced along the years was deciding a title. For a long period of time, I referred either to the project as the Bray Book, mainly to myself, or as Barbara Bray, a woman of letters, mainly for academic purposes. I kept thinking that when the time came, I would find the right title. I was so wrong. And the working title has stuck, though I agree with one reviewer of the book who wrote the following remark: I question the phrase woman of letters, which rings slightly dated to my ear. Well, it does to mine as well. The title of the book, as it now stands, and has been approved by the publisher, is the following: Barbara Bray, woman of letters, translator, radio producer, scriptwriter, critic, and theater director. It's to be published in the Routledge Research in Women's Literature book series. As you will have gathered by now, there is a pun intended on letters, albeit a cliched one. The title refers back to the fact that the idea for the book came to me when writing a presentation on Beckett's published letters and his persona as a self-translator in 2016, when the last of the 4th volume of his correspondence came out with Cambridge UP. In the book, I also rely on many unpublished letters by Bray. Chapter 1, for instance, is framed by 2 letters she wrote to Pinter, the 1974 letter I just quoted, and then another one written in 1982. As for the title of Chapter 1, which serves as the introduction, Transcending Cultural Differences, it comes from this letter. To give you another example, Chapter 5, so this is the 4th volume of the letters. Chapter 5 focused on translating and publishing. In this chapter, I quote this 1965 letter by Barbara Bray to John Calder, where she mentions having to wanting a posterity. The book proposes to assess Barbara Bray's contribution to the World Republic of Letters, to use Pascal Casanova's phrase in the book by the same name, translated in 2004 into English. The focus lies on, on her participation in the construction of post-war European culture, with the underlying belief that translation, along with other forms of cultural communication, plays a crucial role in the spread and exchange of ideas. The second part of the title, translator, radio producer, scriptwriter, critic, and theater director, very long, seeks to do justice to Bray's accomplishments as a multitasking woman of letters, and to show that, as a translator acting in many other fields than just the literary field, she had many translatorial competences, which are all marketable in the different cultural fields in which she intervened. Bray was very vocal about her rights as a multitasking cultural agent. When she did not fight for better fees, she demanded that the variety of the skills involved in her work as an intercultural intermediary be recognized and paid fairly, for instance, when she worked as a freelancer for the BBC. Thus, the main aim I had in mind when writing this monograph was to make these tasks, skills, and roles visible in order to show how they interacted with each other. Now, the very organization of the book reflects Bray's variety of activities in the Republic of Letters. Each chapter focuses on a decade and on an area in which she was active, first radio and the press in the 50s and 60s, then cinema in the 70s, publishing, theater in the 90s and 2000s. Chapter 1 serves as an introduction and covers the years for which I had very little very little archival evidence to work from. These are the formative years and that of Bray's marriage in the late 1940s and 50s, and also the years of her first work experience as a university lecturer in Egypt. The two chapters that follow document Bray's work as radio, script editor, and literary critic for the British media. Chapter 2 re-evaluates Bray's contribution to British public radio during the 7 years she worked in the drama department. She was hired to prepare radio scripts and produced, commissioned, translated, and adapted many European texts for radio. Chapter 3 looks at how, when she left her position at the BBC at the end of 1960 to settle in Paris and live close to Beckett, Bray continued to work for the corporation on a freelance basis, writing scripts and translations for broadcast. It also looks at how she began informing former BBC colleagues about what was happening on the Parisian cultural scene and how she became a cultural and cosmopolitan intermediary, as Pascal Casanova has it. While maintaining her expertise in radio drama, Bray significantly broadened her skills by participating in BBC cultural talk shows and creating innovative programs. This chapter further examines how Bray fought internalized norms about the status and rights of literary translators working in the audiovisual field. In chapter 4, I delve into her screenwriting activity. This started in the 1960s when she became a translator-adapter of plays for BBC television. Bray and Pinter collaborated on the writing of several screenplays. In the early 70s, with Pinter and Losey, she worked on the very famous, though never filmed, adaptation of Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. In 74, Losey and Bray also co-wrote Galileo. That same year, they prepared the script for a biographical film about the founder of Saudi Arabia, and in 75, she traveled to Rome to work with Franco Zeffirelli on the screenplay of Jesus of Nazareth. The next chapter explores a decade during which Bray was at the height of her career as a translator. In this domain, her work was extremely diverse and rich. From 1955 to 2003, she published over 80 translations from the French language, many of which by Marguerite Duras. She also translated historical essays, she was asked to reduce in size, biographies and academic monographs, countless novels by French and Francophone writers. In addition, she collaborated with Samuel Beckett. The couple would systematically discuss the text he was writing and self-translating, as well as the plays he was directing. He would also comment in return upon Bray's own work. Evidence of this reciprocal influence is found in both Bray's and Beckett's oeuvres, even though the help tilted, perhaps unsurprisingly, in favor of the Irish writer. The last chapter concludes this monograph by focusing on Bray's work with theater. After Beckett died in December 1989, she co-founded and managed Dear Conjunction, a Paris-based bilingual theater company. The company has been presenting works by Pinter, Beckett, but also Brian Friel, Martin Krimp, Yasmina Reza, and many others ever since, many of which she directed herself. Now, one of the problems that I had to deal with is the overlap between chapters, which is inevitable. As Bray's multiple lives were hardly ever separate, but I had to adopt this fairly chronological and activity-based approach because it made sense in that it fit the bill of highlighting Bray's achievements in the different cultural fields in which she was active. This also meant that I was not writing a book of translatology, but using some of the tools of translatology, sociology, but also history, literary analysis, and so forth. Instead, reconstructing Bray's life and career meant adopting some of the methods of microhistorians and applying these methods to a case study and to the literary field and the media. This meant digging out many traces, sometimes forgotten or overlooked and dispersed, that Bray and others connected to her have left behind. So first, it was necessary to compile a translator's archive, to use Maria Constanza Guzman's phrase, or actually a writer's archive, really. Because again, Bray was not just a translator. This archive was to compile and testify to her life's work. It is a heterogeneous set of texts that includes articles, scripts, translations, published, unpublished, testimonies, interviews, prefaces, paratext, drafts, letters, notes, contracts, photos. And you have a few examples here. This is a play that she wrote. This is her card from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. I think it's very moving. She's very beautiful as well. And this is an article that she published. It's an interview of Marguerite Duras and Jeanne Moreau, no less, okay, 1962. For this research, I've consulted many publishers' archives as well, because there's no Barbara Bray archive. That doesn't exist, of course, okay? So these are just a few of the places that I was lucky to work in. Sometimes archives will send you manuscripts and documents, which is the case of Austin, the Harry Ransom Center, for instance, where I was able to access the Alfred A. Knopf records. But I also went to Basingstoke in Britain and accessed Léo Mallet's and Jean Genet's editorial files. And much documentation comes from the British Written Archive Centre and the BFI, the British Film Institute. Furthermore, I have also constituted my own personal oral archive by conducting a number of interviews with people who were close to Bray, family, friends, and work colleagues. Much of the material discussed in Chapter 6 is based on these interviews. I also asked Francesca Bray, Barbara's elder daughter, to write a foreword, which she accepted. Indeed, when I had the feeling that there was enough material out there for a book, I contacted Francesca and Julia Bray, Bray's two daughters, who are now two retired academics. Meeting with the approval of the Bray estate was a prerequisite for me. There are several reasons behind this choice that is certainly objectionable on scientific grounds, if one considers that the researcher should be totally free to research and write about what she wants. This decision certainly goes against the myth, I think it's a myth, of the independent scholar or historian, of course. It means giving up pure impartiality and objectiveness. For one thing, from my experience working with unpublished Beckett material, the researcher has to ask permission from the estate to quote anything that is unpublished, even in the context of an academic paper. And very often there's a fee to pay as well. The other reason was more important in my opinion. I felt I had an ethical duty to let the Bray sisters know what I was working on, because if the literary biography I was about to write was supposed to focus primarily on that, the literary, in other words, the professional, Bray's intimate life is so intricately involved with her public life that it would also inevitably delve into the personal, and often the painfully personal. Although I was unlikely to reveal anything that was not already known, as I said, several biographers of Beckett have mentioned the sexual and intellectual relationship he had with Bray. Something Bray herself discussed in the interviews started coming out shortly after her death in 2010. This still remains sensitive material, as I will explain later on. One question I kept asking myself when writing the first chapter was, how much of Bray's personal life should I disclose to strike the right balance between the professional and the personal? I felt that, well, the narrative would be too factual, too cold, too abstract, in other words, boring, if I left out too much of the personal. And at the same time, I could seize the personal. How could I seize the personal without totally interpreting the very few sources that I had at my disposal? Much of what I found was work-related. So I took my cue from Bray herself, and more specifically from the aforementioned 1974 letter to Pinter. In it, she refers in one breath to her living arrangements, to her father's declining health, and to both her daughters' whereabouts and occupations, while talking at length about her recent literary output. I also took my cue from what remains of Bray's personal papers. Amongst these papers are the autobiographical notes she wrote to accompany her unfinished memoir of Samuel Beckett, titled Let Mortals Rejoice. Bray envisaged this memoir of Beckett as a duty to herself, as well as to him to record her point of view. It was not meant to be a biography, yet it was to take on aspects of autobiography. Bray's Beckett book, as she called it, was never finished, maybe because it touched on issues and memories that were too personal and too painful to express in full. My Bray book means to document and do justice to the life's work of an extraordinary woman of letters. It is based on facts taken from all the aforementioned archival sources, and if in its pages I strive as much as possible to leave speculation in the margins, the account can only be a construct, a personal and therefore biased reconstruction of a career based on my understanding and interpretation of documents attesting to it, albeit often cross-referenced, with testimonies from people who witnessed it. Having people close to Bray read through the book, Francesca, for instance, Francesca Bray, the elder daughter, has helped me avoid some factual mistakes and to distinguish between the true and the auto-fictional. This happened with Barbara Bray's claim that her father was a communist, which she mentions in a 2-page typescript headed Indispensable Minimum About Myself, written in 2007. Francesca wrote this to me after I sent her the opening chapter, which was at the end of the process. I wrote the beginning at the end. Chapter 1, page 5, you present Barbara's 2-page indispensable minimum as if it were an accurately factual document. It is, however, an artfully crafted piece of self-fashioning, and therefore far from straightforward. For example, my grandmother was completely shocked when she heard that my mother spoke about my grandfather as being a communist, and said firmly that he had never been anything of the sort. Wicked was actually the word she used. This only arose after my grandfather's death. We couldn't check with him, but it was of a piece with Barbara's romantic claims to be a communist herself. Anyway, just to say that the 2 pages do indeed offer valuable insights, not least into the ways in which, like most people, Barbara rewrote her own backstory. I thus went on to omit the bit about Bray's father being a communist, of course, but mentioned in the following chapters that Bray, identified as a communist, liked to discuss politics with her friends and often argued with them. And this was attested to by the interviews that I did. Intimately linked to the issue of the personal lies the tricky question of self-censorship. I still don't know what to do with the information that Bray wasn't paid any subsidiary rights for the filmic adaptation of The Lover. This was shot in English, so possibly using Bray's text. Bray told several people that Duras, Marguerite Duras, had preferred to keep the money for herself, to buy an apartment for her son, instead of giving her what she was owed for the translation and adaptation rights. I heard this story from different sources, people who knew Bray in the last decades of her life. One reason for refraining from mentioning this is that I do not wish to antagonize Jean Mascolo, Duras' son, who has up to now always granted me permission to quote unpublished material by his mother. And I still want to write on Duras and the people who have translated her. Yeah. I also refrained from quoting directly from Samuel Beckett's unpublished letters. And this for 2 reasons, price and rights. I've been told by several sources that Edward Beckett, Samuel Beckett's nephew, who manages the Beckett estate, does not want to hear about Barbara Bray. I don't know to what extent this is true and have been too much of a coward up to now to actually put the question to him. So I have nearly systematically paraphrased the unpublished material or quoted it from other sources, except a few words here and there. This has also led me to act in the most absurd way when presenting in presence of Edward Beckett and having to avoid offensive words like love triangle, while I was discussing just that, how Bray's affair with Samuel Beckett inspired him to write the scenic play, first performed in 1963, and inspired Bray's radio play, How I Remember Names, broadcast by BBC Radio in 1967. Also, I have chosen not to take into account some of the few written testimonies about Bray that I read. The following example is taken from Deirdre Bair's memoir titled Parisian Lives, Samuel Beckett, Simone de Beauvoir and Me, a memoir, which came out in 2019. Bair was Samuel Beckett's first biographer. The memoir only came to my attention less than 2 years ago. In it, she recounts how she came to underplay Barbara Bray's importance in Samuel Beckett's life. One sensitive relationship that I did verify but did not include in the biography, so it's Bair writing here, concerned the translator Barbara Bray, with whom Beckett had a long-standing affair. It was common knowledge, and almost everyone I spoke to in London and Paris knew about it and took it for granted. I'll just skip a bit because I'm a bit late. With this in mind, I telephoned Barbara Bray to ask for an interview, not about her relationship with Beckett, but about how she worked alone with him on translations. I planned to let the conversation unfold naturally and take its own direction, but she did not give me a chance to explain why I wanted to talk to her. She screamed that she knew why I was calling. If I wrote one word about her relationship with Beckett, one of her children would commit suicide, and she would tell the whole world that I was responsible, the world I was responsible. I tried to stammer some kind of denial, for I was too shocked to think coherently. I never wrote about the affair with Beckett. I chose to ignore this altogether. So much for objectivity. A similar discriminatory stance was taken with sources. Some documents, I believe, are less valuable than others to remember the life of a translator, such as the case with newspaper reviews. They do not frequently mention the translator, and when they do, as Lawrence Venuti has shown, it is often to say that translations read well or not, that they're fluent or not, and that's it. Furthermore, one difficulty lay in how I was going to select what I would be presenting about Bray's career as a translator. It was, of course, impossible for me to read Bray's 80 published translations, and even more so to do a systematic stereoscopic reading of these, to follow Marilyn Gaddis-Rose's phrase. So I decided to focus on a period where she was at the height of her career, and also I followed what came out of the archive, literally. This is a part in the chapter which I called The Battle of the Lover, and which traces how she fought over better translation fees and royalties with American publisher André Schifrin in the 1980s. And this is material that came out of the Columbia Library Archive. Engaging with the life of a woman who had a career in the intellectual milieu in the second half of the 20th century further means that one will encounter issues having to do with femininity and womanhood, and facts and attitudes that sometimes clash with current, and I would think relatively commonly held feminist ideals. It also means that one will be told contradictory and competing narratives that disclose the sometimes disquieting ambivalences and complexities of being a woman, especially and more specifically a mother, and sometimes reveal a picture of the person one is working on that is not always likable. Bray was always very attentive to her daughter's education. She provided them with what she believed was the best intellectual nourishment, as her elder daughter explained to me. This is Francesca saying, "When I passed my level plus, she gave me presents to reward me, and it was an edition of Shakespeare and the Oxford Dictionary of Music. I had to sneak out to buy comics." End of quote. Later in life, Bray would be very proud of her daughter's accomplishments and would always speak very highly of them to her friends. Something her daughters were aware of, as Francesca says. She took great pride in us being intellectually successful. But Francesca also reports on how her mother wasn't a warm person, a warm mother. How her mother had a fraught sense of motherhood. I quote, "She couldn't cope with intimacies and physicality and things like that. You didn't go to Barbara for a hug. You went to Grandma for a hug. Although Barbara didn't like to acknowledge family, she couldn't have done it without her parents," she adds. This was the invaluable support that she always had. If they hadn't said, "Send the girls anytime. We will always look after them. We will always go to the station to meet them." Well, she wouldn't have done it. Significantly, when her daughters turned 18, Bray asked them to stop calling her mum and to call her Barbara instead. She had this thing about family, Francesca further explains. She was wonderful with everybody else. She was such an encouragement, an inspiration for so many people, But at the end, she was sort of apologizing to me. You can't live too many lives at a time, she comments. The priority of her mother's life was Samuel Beckett and literature, I would say, for whom she sacrificed her own freedom and sometimes her daughter's own well-being. Barbara had a complex personality. In the 1970s, she defined herself as a full-time hedonist, whereas to me, exploring her life, she seemed more of an ascetic. She didn't really take holidays, her daughter told me. But her letters do testify to the fact that she enjoyed taking breaks when she was working abroad, for instance, when she was in Rome in 1975. She was an intellectual, she was very bright, but she could also be quite funny. And this is, I'll just, yeah. In fact, Leslie Clack, another co-founder of Dear Conjunction, so one of her, the actors she was colleagues with, told me with much delight, Barbara had a phrase that fits her deep character. When there's strife between couples, she would say, "Oh, well, nothing that a good shag wouldn't put right." Barbara was always so cheery and looking on the bright side, she explains. He explains, she was rarely, you don't have that. She was rarely down in the dumps. Like Winnie in Beckett's Happy Days, Bray easily saw the bright side of things in a desperate situation. Leslie Clack remembers her saying as they were walking in the streets of Dublin or Paris one autumn night, "At least the weather is clearing up, but Barbara, it's pissing with rain." And then I said, "You know, you remind me of Winnie in Happy Days." This is Clack speaking, and she said, "You never said a true word." Well, that's what, how Clack tells the story. So. But then in her interviews with Marek Kadirski, she claimed otherwise. Of course, lots of people think I am Winnie in Happy Days. If it works at all that way, it's rather ironical. And indeed, in the interview, she implied that Suzanne, Beckett's wife, was really the model for Winnie, not herself. Like Winnie also, Bray liked to take care of her appearance. She enjoyed being admired, dressed smartly, and would wear makeup every day, especially when she was expecting company. "Every woman needs to go to the hairdresser once a week," she used to say. And yet, Bray lived the better part of her life in the shadow of a man. She remained invisible to most, while her work with him has remained unrecognized and unacknowledged. "The life I lived might seem paradoxical for a modern, liberated woman," she wrote in 1991. This was a choice she made willingly, though imposed on her by circumstances she could not control. "I valued Samuel Beckett and his work, and what we had together so highly that considerations as minor as time and space never came into it for an instant." This placed her in an untenable situation, which she nonetheless endured for over 30 years. Barbara was absolutely adamant that she did not wish to follow the conventional mode, Francesca Bray analyzes. And at the same time, there was this awful thing that she said, "And there I am, enslaved by a man." So it was really difficult for her. End of quote. Finally, when writing the book, I have also been driven by the wish to give Bray's voice prominence and ensure it is heard. Whenever possible, I quote lengthily from the letters and notes she left. So to finish, if this works, I will let you listen to the only interview of her that I have found during my research. Her voice as recorded for the BBC Oral Archive in 1995 in an interview with Humphrey Carpenter. And so, just yeah.
You want to
put them in? Yeah, I need to first. My phone. I don't have internet.
No, you have. You can connect to.
I don't know what
or.
Just it's to connect.
There is another.
That's fine.
No,
It should be quick. Yeah. Oops. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. I don't know why it disconnected.
An enormous change in that's a paradox, because we did that. We thought it would be a good idea to have human voices producing these natural sounds.
So she's talking about All That Fall, about Samuel Beckett's first radio play, and they met through this in 1956.
And actually afterwards he thought maybe it would have been better not to, but I mean, I didn't agree with him about that. One doesn't have to agree with him about everything. I think it was one of the things that made it so striking at the time as it was.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pascal, also for having to do without a proper computer screen. I'm very sorry about that. As always, some problem, a last-minute problem arise. So now, thank you so much for this beautiful, fascinating talk on Barbara Bray, for having shown us the multiple lives of a translator, also how translation in a way is also maybe the means that helps interconnect everything a little bit. I was very struck by her role as a BBC script writer, also because in this more or less in the same years, I mean, BBC started earlier, but in the 50s, also the Italian television was established in 1954, and we looked at the BBC as a model. And for example, in the case of one of the translators I'm studied, there is also an interconnection between translation, so producing cultural programs for the television, based on translation, based on cultural content which came from abroad. So there was a need of translation and translators. So maybe it was a talent that was more helpful and needed for that. I don't know.
Well, in fact, what happened is the other way around. Bray was first a script editor at the BBC, and that's how she became a translator. It's because she would receive text either in English or already translated or to be translated, that she chose them to offer them to the different channels of the BBC Radio, that she was led to have contact with a lot of translators that she would commission to translate these texts. And then she's translated a few herself. And she did a lot of adapting, meaning that based on the text that was translated literally, she would rewrite them for
the television,
for radio, and then for television. So this is how she started translating, really, seeing others do it and commissioning others. So it's not, she wasn't trained to be a translator. But it certainly led her to have this indeed connection to French letters and to European culture very strong. She was really very well read. Yes, that's true.
No, very, very fascinating and inspiring, really. And I'm very grateful for the honesty how you showed us all the many complexity you had to face, and to the many ethical issues you have to tackle, and how the way also you had to deal with her relatives, and so very interesting indeed. I don't know whether there are questions from the floor. We have probably a few minutes if there is a question. Yes, please. I'll have to ask to come here, otherwise, yes, because the microphone is only here, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much for your most interesting talk. You told us about Barbara Bray, which I confess I didn't know her name. And particularly interesting for me was the way you chose, I'm going to do the same, how you organized your research. But I always have a question, and I question myself as well. And many people in conferences ask that question as well. Do you intend in your book also to say something about the way she translated? I mean, you did what Pim, I think, called the external history of Barbara Bray's translations. Do you intend, or do you think it is important? Because you may think it is not important. I don't have an answer to that question as well in my research.
Well, thank you very much. It is a question. It is a very good question, and I didn't talk about it, but it is a question that I asked myself throughout the writing, and it really had to do with the choice of a publisher, really. So it's Routledge, so it's an academic publisher, which means that there is some translatology in that. So I in the chapter on publishing, I do a comparative analysis of L'Amant and The Lover, and so there are 2-3 pages on that, but it's not as precise as it would have been for an academic paper. But I do delve into her translation strategies, and I also have one bit where I look at her radio translations as well, which are different because she has to adapt and listen to the music even more than for writing, for publishing. So it's a bit specific, seeing that, it's more an adaptation than a translation in the narrow sense of the word. So yes and no. Yes. What is not in there is genetic criticism, which is a question that was already, that I had in mind and has been asked to me. I thought that would be too much, and also because I chose the 1980s, I didn't have any genetic material for that period. The material that I have dates from the 1960s and 1960s mainly. And since I don't focus on this period for translation, I don't have any, genetic analysis. Yeah, so that's going to be published elsewhere, I guess, in journals and that kind of thing. Okay. But yes, it's an excellent question. I mean, for me, the decision came when I knew that the book would be published by Routledge, and that I could really do something academic, but I didn't want it to be too academic. So it's a bit, like a balancing exercise. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pascal.
Yeah.
I think
Thank
we need
so
to.
Yeah, we need to move on.
We need to move on to the next panel. So I leave the table to. See, maybe we can have 1-2 minutes break to just check if we can solve the problem with the computer. And then we'll start with the panel Translating Under Censorship.